My name was synonymous with desire for a decade. Men watched me on screen and forgot where they were. Women studied how I moved. The studio put my face on everything they could think of, and everything they could think of sold. I was the most imitated woman in Hollywood. The hair, the look, the particular way I inhabited a room. And I was 26 years old when I died of something a doctor could have fixed in an afternoon. Those two facts exist in the same sentence because they have to. Because the distance between them is the whole story. Most people who know my name know the image. The platinum hair, the satin gowns, the look that the cinematographer spent hours constructing and I spent 5 minutes making my own. What most people don't know, what was very carefully not discussed in 1937 and has been softened and sentimentalized in every telling since, is what the last days of my life actually looked like. Not the image, the reality. A young woman in a house, getting sicker by the day, while the people around her chose prayer over medicine and schedules over phone calls and image over survival. While an entire industry that had opinions about every detail of my existence looked at what was happening and decided not to interfere. This is not a story about fate. It is not a story about a flame that burned too bright or a star that couldn't survive its own luminance, or any of the other beautiful lies people tell about women who die young in Hollywood. This is a story about a specific sequence of decisions made by specific people who knew what was happening and chose what they chose. I was there for all of it. I was the one it happened to. And I have been waiting a very long time for someone to tell it the way it actually was. Not as a tragedy, not as a cautionary tale, but as an account. Precise, clear, and mine. Kansas City, and then Los Angeles, and then everywhere at once. That's how fast it happened. I want you to understand the speed of it because the speed matters. One year, I was a 16-year-old girl who'd run off and gotten married because I thought that was how you escaped a house that felt too small for the person I was becoming. The next year, I was in front of a camera. The year after that, my face was on billboards across the country, and men I'd never met were writing me letters that I will not describe in polite company. That's how fast the golden age of cinema moved when it decided it wanted you. It didn't ask, it just reached out and took. I was platinum before platinum was a word anyone used that way. The studio did that. The color, the image, the whole construction of what I was supposed to be. And I won't pretend I didn't enjoy parts of it because I did. Hell, I enjoyed a lot of it. I was young and the lights were bright and the world was telling me I was the most desirable thing in it. And there is a particular kind of intoxication in that, especially when you're 17 and 18 and 19 and you've never had anyone treat you like you were worth much of anything before. Hollywood has a way of making the darkness feel glamorous when you're young enough not to see the edges of it yet. But here's what the studio photographs didn't show. Behind the platinum hair and the satin bias cut gowns and the look that cinematographers spent hours perfecting, behind all of it was a girl who was genuinely funny, genuinely warm, genuinely not the thing they were selling. I made people laugh on set. I remembered crew members' names, their kids' names, what was going on in their lives. The image they built was all heat and no heart. The reality was almost the opposite. I had plenty of heat, don't misunderstand me, but the heart was the part that was actually mine. And the heart, as it turned out, was the part nobody thought to protect. The studio system in the early 1930s was not a place you worked. It was a place you were processed. You came in one thing and they turned you into a product. And the product had a name and a look and a set of approved behaviors and a publicist who told you what to say when someone pointed a microphone at your face. I was under contract before I was old enough to fully understand what a contract meant. What it meant not just legally, but practically, in terms of what you gave up and what you got back, and whether those two things were ever going to balance. They weren't. They never were. But the lights were bright and the money was real. And I was a girl from Kansas City who'd had very little of either. The image they built for me was specific, dangerous, the kind of woman who could ruin a man just by walking into a room. And I played it. God help me, I played it well. Because I understood instinctively what the camera wanted, and I gave it to them. The golden age of cinema rewarded that kind of fluency. If you could read a room, if you could feel where the light was falling and adjust yourself to it without being told, they kept you very busy and paid you reasonably well and told everyone you were a star. What they didn't tell you was that the star was a character, and the character belonged to them, and the woman underneath the character was on her own. What I remember about those early years on the lot is the exhaustion. Not the glamour, the exhaustion. The 4 a.m. calls, the hours in makeup, the retakes, the fittings that went until midnight, the publicity obligations stacked on top of the actual work of making pictures. I was making 3-4 films a year. The studio system ran on volume, and volume ran on bodies, and the bodies were ours. Nobody asked how you were holding up. Nobody checked whether the machine was running too hot. You were an asset on a ledger, and assets don't get tired, and assets certainly don't get sick. I want you to remember that last part. Assets don't get sick, because later, much later, when it actually mattered, that accounting was going to cost me everything. Let me tell you about my mother, because you cannot understand what happened to me at the end without understanding her first. Who she was, what she believed, and how completely those beliefs shaped every decision she made, including the last one she made on my behalf. My mother was a beautiful woman, charming, larger than life, the kind of person who filled a room the way I filled a room, which is probably not a coincidence. She loved me. I want to say that clearly and without qualification, because what came later is easier to misread if you don't start there. She loved me. She was also, in ways that took me years to fully reckon with, the most dangerous person in my life. She was a Christian Scientist, devoutly, completely, without a single crack of doubt in the foundation of it. And for those who don't know what that means in practice, it means no doctors, no medicine, no medical intervention of any kind, because illness is understood not as a physical event, but as a spiritual one, a failure of alignment with God, something to be corrected through prayer and faith rather than through anything a physician might offer. I grew up inside that belief system. It was the water I swam in. And when you grow up inside something that total, you don't question it the way you'd question something you encountered as an adult. It's just the shape of the world, the way things are, the framework through which everything else is interpreted. The problem, the specific and fatal problem, was that my mother's faith did not diminish when my circumstances changed. When I became the most photographed woman in Hollywood, when my face was on the cover of every magazine, and my name was above the title on pictures that made the studio millions, none of that updated her theology. I was still her daughter, which meant I was still under the jurisdiction of her God, which meant that when my body started to fail, quietly at first and then not quietly at all, the response was going to be prayer. It was always going to be prayer. The studio knew who my mother was. The studio knew what she believed. And the studio, which had opinions about everything else in my life, said nothing. I was married 3 times before I was 25. I want to say that out loud because the number tends to produce a reaction, a kind of judgment that I've gotten used to. The raised eyebrow, the implication that there's something unstable or reckless in a woman who tries that many times to build something with another person. But here's what I'd ask you to consider instead. I was a girl who grew up in a house organized entirely around one woman's relationship with God, where the emotional temperature was set by someone else's faith and someone else's needs. And I spent my entire young life looking for a room where I was the thing that mattered most. That's not recklessness, that's hunger. And Hollywood in the 1930s had a lot of hungry people and very few rooms that were actually safe. The marriages were each their own education. The first one I ran toward at 16 to get out of Kansas City. It didn't last, and I can't say I'm surprised. The second one nearly broke me in ways I still don't fully have language for. He was a man the industry knew, a man with power, and what happened inside that marriage stayed inside it because that was how things worked in the Hollywood studio system. What happened behind closed doors was managed, contained, kept away from the columnists in the fan magazines and the carefully constructed public narrative. The studio was very good at that kind of management. They managed my image, my schedule, my public statements. They managed my marriages when the marriages became inconvenient. What they could not manage, or would not, was my mother. The third marriage was the one that felt real, the one where I thought, for a specific and luminous period of time, that I had finally found the version of my life that fit. He was funny. He was kind in the particular way that matters, the quiet daily way, not the grand gesture way. And I was happy, genuinely happy, which in retrospect feels important to note because happiness was not always the dominant weather of my life. I was 24, 25. I had everything the world considered worth having. I was also, though I didn't know it yet, already sick. The body keeps its own calendar, indifferent to yours. Mine had already started counting down. I just hadn't been told. Let me give you the other side of it, because it existed and it was real, and I won't pretend otherwise just because the story ends the way it ends. There were days, weeks, whole stretches of time when being me was the most extraordinary thing imaginable. The sets they built for us in those years were monuments. Entire worlds constructed on a lot in Culver City, every detail period perfect, every surface designed to catch the light in the most beautiful possible way. I'd walk onto a set in the morning in a costume that cost more than most people made in a year, and the crew would go quiet for just a moment. Not because of me exactly, but because of what the whole thing added up to. The lights and the gown and the set and the moment right before the camera rolled when everything was possible. The comedies were where I was most myself. That's the part of the record I want to correct while I have the chance. The image they sold was all danger and desire, the platinum temptress, the woman you couldn't look away from. And yes, fine, that was part of it. But put me in a comedy and something else happened entirely. I had timing, real timing, the kind you can't manufacture, the kind that either lives in you or doesn't. I could take a line that was ordinary on the page and find the exact angle that made it land differently, made it funny in a way the writer hadn't quite anticipated. The directors noticed. My co-stars noticed. The audiences noticed, even if the studio kept trying to sell them something else. And the people, the actual human beings who made up the industry I worked in, I loved them. The crew on a picture becomes a kind of family, the particular intense temporary family that forms when a group of people are all pointed at the same thing for weeks at a time. I knew the names of the electrician's children. I brought food to set. I stayed late when someone needed another take, Not because the studio required it, but because the work mattered to me and the people doing it mattered to me. That was the me that didn't make it into the fan magazines. Not the platinum hair and the satin gowns, but the woman who made the gaffer laugh on a Tuesday morning and meant it. That woman was real. She was the realest thing about any of it, and she deserved better than what was coming. The signals were there before I knew how to read them. Fatigue that went deeper than the schedule could account for, and the schedule was brutal, so that's saying something. A heaviness in my body that felt different from tired, felt like something structural rather than something a night's sleep would fix. I mentioned it the way you mention things you don't want to be true, in passing, lightly, as if giving it too much attention might make it more real. The studio noticed I was slowing down and attributed it to the workload, which was convenient for everyone, including me, because it meant nobody had to look at what was actually happening. Hollywood has always been very good at not looking directly at things that would complicate the schedule. The kidney problems had been building for years. I know that now. Scarlet fever as a child that was never properly treated, because of course it wasn't, because my mother's God handled illness, not physicians, had left damage that was quietly accumulating interest the whole time I was becoming the most photographed woman in America. My body was carrying a debt nobody had told me about, contracted in childhood, due without warning. By the time I was 25, I was working on a picture and feeling genuinely unwell in a way that was hard to ignore and harder to explain to people whose primary concern was whether I'd be ready for my 7 a.m. call. I was always ready for my 7 a.m. call. That was the thing about me that the studio could count on. I showed up. I always showed up. What I needed was a doctor. What I got was prayer. My mother was present in my life in the specific, suffocating way that mothers who love you completely and understand you partially tend to be present, everywhere, well-intentioned, immovable. She could see I wasn't well. She responded the way her faith instructed her to respond, which meant she responded with God and not with medicine. And the people around us, the studio, the people who were paid to manage every aspect of my existence, watched this happen and made a calculation. The calculation was about the picture I was currently making, the schedule, the cost of a production halt, the inconvenience of confronting a difficult woman about her difficult beliefs. They did the math. They chose the picture. I want you to sit with that. Here is what happened. I want to give it to you plainly, without drama, because the facts are dramatic enough on their own, and they don't need my help. In late May of 1937, I collapsed on set. Not metaphorically, physically, my body giving out in the middle of a production day, in front of the crew, in front of my co-star, in front of people who knew exactly what they were seeing and knew exactly what it meant. I was taken home. My mother was called. My mother prayed. The studio was notified. The studio sent flowers. I lay in that house for days. Days. While my kidneys failed incrementally and my body filled with the toxins that healthy kidneys filter out, while my temperature climbed and my mind started to go unclear at the edges, while every hour that passed without medical intervention was an hour that narrowed the distance between where I was and where I was going. Through all of that, the primary response of the people responsible for my well-being was theological. My mother prayed. She brought in a Christian Science practitioner, a person whose job was to pray more professionally than a layperson could manage. The practitioner prayed. God, apparently, was not picking up. The studio knew. I need you to understand that clearly and completely. The studio knew what was happening in that house, knew my mother's beliefs, knew I was not receiving medical care, knew the days were passing. These were not naive people. These were people who had opinions about what I ate, what I wore, who I was seen with in public, what I said in interviews, which roles I took and which I declined. They managed every variable of my professional existence with extraordinary attention to detail. And they did not pick up the phone and call a doctor. They did not send someone to that house with the authority to override a mother's faith with a daughter's survival. They protected the image and they let the woman inside it go. I was 26 years old. I had a kidney infection, and nobody came. My father came eventually. Not my mother's God, not the studio, not the machinery that had spent a decade manufacturing and selling every version of me they could think of. My father, who drove to that house and looked at what he found there and did what should have been done days earlier. He called a doctor. He called several doctors. And the doctors came and looked at me and said what anyone with medical training would have said on day one if day one had been allowed to happen. That I was in acute renal failure, that I needed hospitalization immediately, that the time that had passed had done damage that could not be undone by the intervention that was now finally, too late, being permitted. They put me in the hospital. My father held my hand. I was 26 years old and the most desired woman in Hollywood, and I weighed 80 pounds. I died on June 7th, 1937. The picture I had been making was never finished. The studio released a statement expressing profound grief. The fan magazines ran memorial issues. The columnist who had spent years writing about my marriages and my platinum hair and my onset behavior wrote elegies that described me as a tragedy, a flame that burned too bright, the kind of language people reach for when they want to make a death feel inevitable rather than preventable. Because preventable is a harder word. Preventable requires you to look at the specific chain of decisions that produce the outcome, to name the people who were present at each link of that chain, to ask what they knew and when they knew it and what they chose to do with that knowledge. Nobody wanted to ask those questions in 1937. I'm asking them now. What I want you to carry out of this room is not grief. I've had enough of other people's grief about me. It tends to be more about them than about what actually happened. What I want you to carry is precision. The precise understanding that I did not burn out. I was not a tragedy in the classical sense, not fate working itself out through a beautiful woman's early death. I was a person who needed a doctor and was surrounded by people who could have gotten her one and chose, for different reasons, not to. My mother chose faith. The studio chose the schedule. The industry chose not to interfere with either. 3 choices, made by people who all believed, in their different ways, that they were doing right by me. The road to 26 years old and 80 pounds is paved with people doing right by you. Remember that when someone tells you they have your best interests at heart. Ask them what they're willing to actually do about it. So now you know what the fan magazines didn't print and the studio statements didn't say and the elegies got wrong. You know about the days in that house. You know about the prayer and the schedule and the calculation that was made about which mattered more, the woman or the picture she was supposed to finish. And I want to ask you something before you go, something I want you to actually think about and not just move past. How many times have you watched someone disappear slowly, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, day by day, while the people around them found reasons not to intervene? How many times has a system that claimed to care about someone demonstrated through its actual behavior that what it really cared about was the product that person represented? The Hollywood studio system of the 1930s was not a uniquely evil institution. It was a machine that did what machines do. It optimized for output. It protected its assets. It managed inconvenience. I was an asset who became inconvenient, and the machine responded accordingly. What makes my story worth telling is not that it was exceptional. It's that it wasn't. Behind the scenes, Hollywood was full of people whose well-being was subordinated to the requirements of the machinery around them, whose bodies and minds and lives were treated as inputs in a production calculation. I am the one you know about because I died at 26 and the death was too visible to entirely suppress. The ones you don't know about are the ones who survived it and stayed quiet because staying quiet was the price of staying employed. If my story does anything, I want it to make you a more careful reader of the official version. The official version of my death was grief and flowers and memorial issues and the language of inevitability. The real version was days and decisions and people who knew and didn't come. Every official version of every story has a real version underneath it, and the real version always has names attached to it, and the names always belong to people who made choices. I was 26 years old. I had a kidney infection. The choice to let me die was made by people who loved me, in their way, and by people who profited from me, in theirs. That combination, love and profit, faith and schedule, the personal and the institutional, all pointing in the same direction, that is the most dangerous thing I ever encountered in Hollywood, and I encountered quite a lot. Share this. Talk about it, because the machine is still running. It just has a different name now.